This is a wug. Now there are two of them. There are two. If you said wugs, congratulations, you're probably a native speaker of English. You've just participated in one of the most famous linguistic experiments of all time, called the Wug Test. The creator of this experiment, Jean Berko Gleason, was interested in understanding how children acquire the rules of English. When this study was done in 1958, we didn't yet know if children were simply memorizing the plural forms of nouns, or whether they were learning the actual rule for forming the plural in English by adding that S ending. Regular nouns made it seem more likely that children would learn the rule of adding an S, so cat becomes cats, dogs becomes dogs, but there are a lot of irregular nouns out there too. For example, man becomes men and mouse becomes mice. Do children simply memorize all of the plurals regardless of whether they're regular or irregular? Or did they learn the rule about adding plural S and then have some irregular ones that they have to memorize? That's what Gleason was getting at in this experiment. The problem is English plurals are a little more complicated than just adding an S to a word. There are actually 3 different pronunciations of the plural S in English depending on the sound that the noun ends in. So if a sound ends in what we call a voiceless consonant, one where your vocal folds aren't vibrating, like P, T, or K, then the plural is simply pronounced S. So cat becomes cats, cup becomes cups. However, if the word ends in a voiced consonant where your vocal folds are vibrating, like a B, D, or G, then that plural is actually pronounced as a Z. So you say dogs, not dogs. You say beds, not beds. However, if the word ends in a sibilant sound, such as S, Z, sh, ch, j, and zh, then the plural is pronounced is, with a vowel in there, I-Z. So house becomes houses, not house. Maze becomes mazes, not maze. So what Gleason wanted to know was whether young children had knowledge of these rules, and if so, how did their knowledge develop? To find this out, she made up a bunch of random words ending in different sounds, and used those sounds to describe pictures of made-up creatures and things, just like we did at the beginning of this video. One of the things that she created and gave a name to was the wug. What she found out was that very young children didn't understand the question and would often answer with the singular. So if they were asked about wugs, they would often answer just wug instead of wugs. Younger children could, however, give the correct answer for existing words that they already knew, but not the new made-up words. By contrast, children of age 6 could apply these rules to new words that they had never heard before. What this tells us is that children start by memorizing the different forms of a word, but over time they learn to extract the pattern that's happening. They understand that plural S rule and all of its forms. Gleason also found that children had the easiest time pronouncing it as an S ending, but when it was supposed to be a Z ending, sometimes they got tripped up. They could usually answer Z correctly just fine after words ending in stop consonants like B, D, or G, but they really struggled applying that Z rule to words that ended in nasals or approximants like L, R, M, or N. Finally, they had the hardest time with the sibilants. Even some of the older children still struggled to apply that is rule, the IZ. What this tells us is that children acquire the different pronunciations of the plural suffix in English gradually, starting with the most default S form, then the voiced form, and then the complex form of IZ. They learn the most general rule first, add an S to everything, and then the more specific rules that only apply in certain contexts, such as adding an IZ if it ends in a sibilant. That's a much more specific rule than the generic add an S to everything. The order in which they learned these pronunciations also matches universal tendencies about language itself. Voiceless consonants like S are much more common in the world's languages than voiced consonants like Z. Some languages don't even have voiced consonants. So the Wug Test is a groundbreaking study in linguistics because it taught us so much about how children acquire the grammar of their language. If you want to learn more about how language works, subscribe to my channel.